We continue now at the top of Daf Chafei Beis Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 25b. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a brisa that deals with dam shenitma v'zarko, if you have blood that became tamei, and then it was thrown by a yachid, by an individual. So then we say that since it's meratza, it is accepted if it is b'shogeg, if it's by mistake, but b'mezid, it is not accepted. B'tzibor, if it is communal, so then it doesn't matter, shogeg or mezid, it is accepted. And then when it comes to ovdei kochavim, when it comes to a non-Jew, the brisa said on the previous summit that it doesn't matter if it's shogeg or mezid, if it's onus or ratzon, lo hurtza, it will not be accepted. And Rashi explains shogeg, kasavar, the Tana holds ein karbanos mekabel and tumah, that karbanos are not mekabel tumah, they don't receive tumah. And ba'ones shenitma bal karcho, onus means, as opposed to shogeg, which is a mistake, onus means it happened against his will. And Rashi also notes aval mezid v'ratzon, when it comes to mezid and ratzon, chada milsi, those are actually identical. There's no difference between mezid and ratzon, even though there is a technical difference between shogeg and onus. Ela'idi de tana onus, tana ratzon, since it says onus, so ratzon is usually the counterpart to onus. But again, the point is that when it comes to ovdei kochavim, it doesn't matter whether it's shogeg or mezid, onus or ratzon, it makes no difference. Lo hortza, it will not be accepted, because it's written in the pasuk, v'hayal mitzcho tamid l'ratzon lahem, it says it's going to be l'ratzon lahem, v'lo la'ovdei kochavim, and not for ovdei kochavim. And the Gemara continues, Uramini, we have a contradiction from the following brisa. The brisa says, Al mahat tzitz meratza. What is the tzitz meratza for? Al hadam v'al habasar v'al hachelev shenitma, on the blood and the meat and the chelev that becomes tamei, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'onas, bein b'ratzon. Doesn't matter if it's shogeg, mezid, onus, or ratzon, by mistake, on purpose, whether it happens bal karcha, against his will, or whether it's b'ratzon, whether it's willingly. Bein b'yachid, bein b'tzibor, doesn't matter if it's an individual or communal. And so here you have a contradiction within yachid, as Rashi explains, Uraminhu alma tzitz meratza amezid diyachid. You see from this brisa that when it comes to an individual, the tzitz is meratza not only b'shogeg, but it is also meratza b'mezid. That's the contradiction between the two brisas. Again, specifically by yachid, by an individual, is the tzitz meratza b'mezid or not? The second brisa seems to say it is meratza b'mezid. The first says it's not. And before proceeding to the answer of the Gemara to the contradiction between the two brisas, we will take a look at the Shita Mekubetzes. The Shita Mekubetzes is addressing the line in the second brisa which says V'al habasar. Again, the second brisa says that the tzitz is meratz on the dam and the basar and the chelev shenitma, the blood or the meat or the chelev that became tamei, whether shogeg, mezid, onus, or ratzon, whether yachid or tzibor, that tzitz is going to affect acceptance. We understand that by the dam we're talking about the application of the blood to the mizbeach. By the chelev we're talking about the burning of the chelev on the mizbeach. That's one of the sacrificial portions. But what are we talking about in terms of the basar? What does it mean that the tzitz is meratze? And the Shita Mekubetza says V'al habasar, on the meat, and this really comes from a Gemara Psachim. V'im tomar l'may mahani le ritzoy tzitz. What are we talking about ritzoy tzitz when it comes to the basar, the meat of a carbon? La'ochla tameo efshar. We can't be saying that the meat can be eaten if it becomes tamei. That's impossible. Da'aksib, because it's written in the pasuk v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yachel. It says that if the meat touches anything that's tamei, it cannot be eaten. So there's a prohibition to eat the tamei meat of kachim. So that cannot be what the brisa means. V'yesh lomar, and so the Shita Mekubetza says we can answer as follows: to Rabbi Yoshua de Amar, according to Rabbi Yoshua, who says imein basar ein dam, that if there's no meat then there's no blood. So then nicha, so then we can say the following: the mahani le ritzoy tzitz, the ritzoy of the tzitz will be effective. La'achshuve basar kamandi isay. Now it's like the meat is still present. The fact that it's tamei doesn't take the meat away. V'lizrok hadam alen. So therefore, if the meat becomes tamei, it's saying that still the throwing of the blood, the application of the blood, is still allowed. V'lo chashvinan le kamandalese. We don't consider it as if the meat is no longer there, in which case, again, it would be problematic to throw the blood. V'afilu Rabbi Eliezer d'amar yesh dam. Now, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, who says that the blood is allowed to be thrown in a situation where there's no meat, afal bisha ein basar, even though there's no meat. Afilu hachi, nevertheless, mahani le ritzoy tzitz. Still, the ritzoy of the tzitz, the acceptance of the tzitz is effective. La'akvui bepigul ulahotzio midei meila. That still we say that there can be a liability of pigul and that there is no meila. Still, again, the throwing of the blood is going to have that effect if we're going to say that the tzitz is meratza. And so therefore, again, with regards to those halachas, that's what we mean, that there is ritzoy tzitz by the meat. And in any case, the Gemara now continues and answers the contradiction between the brisas. Amar Rav Yosef says, Lokash, it's not difficult. Har Rabbi Yossi, har Rabbanan. One brisa is following the opinion of Rav Yossi. That's going to to be this second brisa that says again, if there's tuma bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'onas, bein b'ratzin, bein b'yachid, bein b'tzibor, that sits is maratza, that's going to follow Rabbi Yossi. And the first brisa, which distinguishes by the carbon of a private individual between shogeg and mezid, and says it's only accepted b'shogeg and not b'mezid, that's going to follow the Rabbanan in the following brisa. Titania, as we learned in the brisa, in tarmin min hatame al hatar, we don't take off truma from tame produce on tahor produce. V'im taram, and if the person did take off truma from tame on tahor, so b'shogeg truma so truma. So if it's done b'shogeg, it's good truma. B'mezid ain't truma so truma. If it's done b'mezid, so then the truma is not good truma. We'll see Rashi in a moment. But b'mezid, this is actually a knas. It's a fine that's imposed by the Rabbanon, and that's the same thing that's going on in the first brisa. In the first brisa, when it says when the dam becomes tameh, so then it's going to be accepted b'shogeg, but not b'mezid. The idea is that it's accepted b'shogeg, and that's true on a doraisa level because the tzitz is meratza. And really b'mezid also, it should be accepted on a doraisa level, but the Rabbanon impose a fine, and they say that the tzitz is not going to be meratza on a derabbanon level, therefore one is not able to partake of the carbon. That's going to be the first brisa. And Rabbi Yossi says, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, there is no fine imposed, and so therefore it doesn't matter if the truma is taken from tameh on tahor b'shogeg or b'mezid, truma so truma, it is going to be a good truma. And Rashi explains, b'shogeg truma so truma, if it's done by mistake, so then it's a good truma. Damrinan bekam aduchti, we say in several places, velosisu olav chet, emeno kadosh nesias chet lama, if it's not holy, so why are we talking about the carrying the burden of the sin? Mikan, so from here we learn, l'torim min haro al hayaf, if one takes truma from that which is bad on that which is good, that would be like this case, min hatame al hatar, so shetruma so truma, that still is going to be a good truma on a doraisa level, but b'mezid ain't truma so truma, but if it's done b'mezid, again, according to the Rabbanon, it's not good truma. The Rabbanon kansu, because the Rabbanon impose a fine, mishum dehezid, since he did it on purpose. Upligi ba amorai b'yavamos b'perakaisha, there's a machlokas amoraim and yavamos in this regard. Ikol aman damar ein truma so truma, some say that it means, when we say ein truma so truma, if it's done b'mezid, what that means is, l'sakein es hashirayim, that means the remainder is not going to be fixed. Generally, when you take off truma, so you fix everything else, that it's no longer considered to be tevel, that's what the Rabbanon imposed the fine, that the shirayim, the remainder is not fixed, avol truma have it, but it is going to be truma, it is considered to be truma, and in any case, again, the first bryce is going to follow the Rabbanon. That's why we make a distinction between shogeg and mezid. By mezid, we impose a fine, and we say on a Rabbanon level that the tzitz is not meratza, and again, according to the second bryce that follows Rabbi Yossi, there is no knas, and therefore the tzitz is going to be meratza, both b'shogeg and b'mezid. But the Gemara continues and asks, Amor de Shamat Leila Rabbi Yossi. We can say that we hear from Rabbi Yossi in this brisa, the lo kanis, that he doesn't impose the fine, that much is true. But the meratza tzitz al achilos, but the idea that the tzitz would be meratza even on achilos, even on the eating of the carbon, mishamatle, do we see that Rabbi Yossi goes that far? V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Eliezer says, hatzitz meratza al achilos, the tzitz is meratza on achilos, on the eating of the carbon. Rabbi Yossi says, Einat tzitz meratz al achilos, that the tzitz is not meratz on achilos, and what the Gemara is focusing on over here is, again, in the second brisa, it didn't simply say that the tzitz is meratz al hadam, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'onas, bein b'ratzon, bein b'yachid, bein b'tzibor. The brisa said that tzitz is meratz on the dam, and the basar and the chaylev, and when we're talking about basar, we're talking about achilos as well. It goes even that far, and that's why the question of the Gemara is, if Rabbi Yossi says, Ein hatzitz meratz al achilos, how does that fit with the brisa, which says that the tzitz is meratza al habasar? Rashi explains the meratza tzitz al achilos mishamatle. Does Rabbi Yossi go so far as to say meratza tzitz al achilos? The mukmas lahach brisa basraisa, because we're saying that the latter brisa is alibe. We're saying that follows Rabbi Yossi's opinion. The katani bahat tzitz meratza al achilas tomas basar dehainu achilos. It says again that tzitz is meratza an achilas tomas basar, which refers to achilos. And lahachi nakan achilos. The reason why we're focusing on achilos, the eating of the carbon, diaolin kulialma modu de tzitz meratz, in terms of the fact that it can ascend on the mizbeach, or it's applied to the mizbeach, that everybody agrees that tzitz is meratza. To katani b'reish Toras Kohanim, we learn in the beginning of Toras Kohanim, v'nir tzolo l'chaper olav, it says v'nir tzolo l'chaper olav, b'dam, that's by the blood, d'chsiv, because it's written, ki hadam hu b'nefesh yechaper, it uses the word yechaper by blood, ein li ala dam tahar, I only know if the blood is tahar, tamei minayin, from where do we know if it's tamei? Talmud lomar v'nasa Aaron, it says v'nasa Aaron, V'hu bedam kamayri, and that's by dam, that's by blood. D'chsiv l'rotzon lahem, it says l'rotzon lahem. V'hacha ksiv v'nirtza, and it says over here v'nirtza. Ma'hacha dam, afasam dam, just like here we're talking about blood, so to there we're talking about blood. V'yein li ela dam, I only know blood. Minayin l'rabos kol ha'olam, from where do we know everything that ascends on the mizbeach? That tzitz can be meratza for that. Talmud lomer l'chol matnos kodsheyem, the pasuk says l'chol matnos kodsheyem. And again, when we're talking here about achilos, we're not talking about the actual eating of the meat, as the Shita Mekubetzes already said. The meat cannot be eaten when it's tamei, that's not a question. But the issue over here is if the meat becomes tamei before the blood is thrown, so again, is the tzitz meratza? That's what it means, that tzitz is meratza al achilos. And again, Rabbi Eliezer says that tzitz is meratza al achilos, and therefore, if the meat becomes tamei before the blood is thrown, the blood is still able to be thrown. But that is not true according to Rabbi Yossi. The tzitz is not meratza al achilos. We understand it's meratza al ha'olin, but it's not meratza al achilos, and so therefore, to say that this latter bryce is following Rabbi Yossi, it's going to work in terms of the idea that Rabbi Yossi does not impose a fine in situations of b'mezid. That much is true, but we know that Rabbi Yossi holds einat tzitz meratza al achilos, and the second bryce seems to be saying that the tzitz is meratza al achilos. That's the question of the Gemara. And the Gemara continues and answers, Epuch, we can just reverse the opinions. Rabbi Eliezer Omer ein hatzitz meratz al achilos. Let's say that Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says that the tzitz is not meratz al achilos, and Rabbi Yossi Omer hatzitz meratz al achilos, and Rabbi Yossi is the one that says that tzitz is meratz al achilos. And then again, we can go back to this very same answer. The second brisa is following Rabbi Yossi. So again, Rabbi Yossi does not impose a fine in situations of mezid, and Rabbi Yossi holds that tzitz is meratz al achilos, and therefore the second brisa can be Rabbi Yossi. But the Gemara continues and asks, Maskif lo Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes asked the following question, Umi motzis afchesla, can we really reverse the opinions? Can we really say that it's Rabbi Eliezer who says that tzitz is not meratz al achilos, and Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that tzitz is meratz al achilos? V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa. The brisa says, Yochol basar shenitma lefnei zrikas damim. One might think that if the meat became tamei before zrikas damim, and Rashi over here notes, we're not really talking necessarily about basar shenitma. The key point over here is meat before zrikas damim. Rashi says, Yachol basar shenitma lefnei zrikas damim. One might think that if the meat became tamei before zrikas damim, va'achalo lefnei zrika. The case over here in the brisa is that this meat was eaten before the zrikas hadam, b'tomas haguf, while the person was tamei. Now, before the zrikas hadam, the meat really isn't permitted to be eaten at all. The zrikas hadam is the matir, that is the permitter that allows the meat of the carbon to be eaten. And so the brisa is dealing with a situation where the person was tamei, normally would be chayiv kares if he eats the carbon while he is tamei, but here he's eating from the meat before zrika, and so it's before the meat was really permitted. So one might think yehu chayav in all of kares. One might think that he's liable to kares in that case. And Rashi notes, v'toras kohanim matzasi lashon nikiya. In Toras Kohanim, I found a different version that's a cleaner version, so to speak. Yachol yehu chayavin misham tumas haguf. The phrasing over there is as follows: one might think that there's a liability due to tumas haguf lifnei zrika, before zrika, ubebasar tar kamayrin. According to that version, again, we're talking about pure meat. It doesn't need to be talking about basar shenitma, because the whole discussion in the beginning of this brisa is simply lifnei zrika. And so again, the brisa says, Yachol basar shenitma lifnei zrikas damim. One might think that the meat before zrikas damim, yu chayavin alein mishum tuma. One might think there's liability. Let's say the person eats that meat while he is tamei, he's going to get kares. One might think that. Talmud lomer, the pasuk says, Kol tahar yochal basar. It says anyone who's pure should eat the meat. V'hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlam asher la'Hashem v'tomaso olav v'nichra. So it says that again, if a person is tamei, then he's going to get kares if he eats from that meat. And we learn from there, hanitar latahorin chayavin olav mishum tuma. If the meat became permitted to those who are pure, meaning the zrikas hadam took place, then there's a liability due to tuma. If the person is tuma, he's going to get kares if he eats that meat. But v'she'eno nitar latahorin. But if the meat was not permitted to those who are pure, there was no zrikas hadam, so then ein chayavin olav mishum tuma. Then there's no liability due to tuma. And Rashi explains, v'she'eno nitar latahorin, if it is not permitted to tahorin, kagonim achal afilu basar tar. Again, if for example the person eats even pure meat, but he eats it betumas haguf, he eats it when he is tamei, kodem zrikas dam, before the blood is thrown, adayin lo haisa niteres letahorim. At that point in time, the meat has not yet been permitted to tahorim. The zrika hi hamateres, because it's the zrika which is the matter, that is what causes it to become permitted. And so therefore we learn from the pasuk there's no liability before the zrikas hadam. And the Brisa continues and says, Oeino elo nechol latahor and chayav and olav misham tuma. Maybe we should say that if it is eaten by those who are pure, there's a liability. V'she'eino nechol latahor, and if it's not eaten by those who are pure, meaning even after the zrikas hadam, you can have situations where the meat is not allowed to be eaten because of other disqualifications. So then ein chayav and olav misham tuma. Maybe even after zrikas hadam, you can have situations where there's no liability. As the Brisa explains, otzi anias halon v'yasayotze, then I would be able to exclude, let's say it was left overnight, or let's say it left the proper area. Those are all disqualifications that happen after the zrikas hadam. She'eino nechol in the tahorim, where it's not eaten to tahorim. Maybe over there as well there's no liability of eating it b'tomas haguf. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says asher laHashem. It says asher laHashem riba. That pasuk is an inclusion, and so therefore lon and yotze, there is going to be a liability. There is going to be kares if the person eats it b'tomas haguf. Rashi explains, Oeino elohachi darshinan. Maybe we darshan as follows: She'eino nechol letahor, and if it's not eaten by those who are pure, ein chayavin misham tomas haguf. There's no liability of tomas haguf. Af sheniter letahor, and even if it was permitted already to tahorin, even if it's after zrika. V'yotzi as halon v'as hayotzi, then I would exclude lon and yotze la'achar zrika, after zrika. She'ava bisheniter bezrika, meaning even though they were permitted through the zrika. Hoel v'achshav ira bopsol, since now there was this other disqualification on the meat. Lo yuhu chayavin olav ha'ochla betuma. Maybe there's no liability if one eats it betuma. And again, the Brisa said that is not the case because it says asher laHashem, and that is an inclusion, and therefore in these cases, by lon and yotze, there is going to be a liability. That's what it means, asher laHashem riba. But the Brisa continues, now yochol shanimar be'es ha'pigulin v'es ha'nosaros. One might think to include other cases. Let's say pigul and nosar, maybe we should include that as well. Now the Gemara interrupts and says, nosaros hainu lon. What do you mean nosaros? Nosaros is lon. We already said that lon, if it's left overnight, that's the same as nosar, that is included. So that cannot be what the Brisa means, and so the Gemara revises it. Ella, rather, the Brisa means as follows: Af hapigulin kinosaros. One might think we should include pigul just like nosar. Again, we've included liability by nosar already. We've said that the pasuk says asher laHashem riba, and therefore lon and yotze, there is a liability to kares. One might think pigul as well. Pigul is talking about a situation where there was an intention outside of the proper time, and then the carbon becomes pigul. Maybe that should be included as well. Talmud Lomar mizevach hashlamim. It says mizevach hashlamim, and when it says mizevach hashlamim miet, that is an exclusion, and therefore we exclude pigul. In a situation of pigul, there's not going to be a liability of kares if the person eats it b'tomas haguf. The kares for tomas haguf is not going to apply. The Brisa says umar reisa l'rabos as elu lahotzi as elu. How do you know to include this and to exclude that? How do you know which to include and which to exclude? Achar shariba hakasuv umiet. Once we have an inclusion from the pasuk and an exclusion, amrit. So we say as follows: Marba ani as elu. We include these cases lon and yotze shahaisa lehen shasa kosher. At least those had a moment where it was kosher, where it was permissible. Umotzi ani as elu. But I exclude the case of pigul shalo haisa lehen shasa kosher. There was no moment where it was really rendered fit, and therefore that is excluded. And the Brisa continues and says, V'im Tomer, now if you're going to ask, what about the following case? What if the meat became tameh before the zrikas damim, before the blood was thrown? But then the blood was thrown and it's eaten b'tumas haguf after the blood was thrown. So over there we're also saying that there's a liability, because again, in that situation there was a zrikas hadam, and therefore it was permitted. We don't care that the basar became tameh, but why is there a liability in that case? There's no shasa kosher, because in that case it was already tameh before the zrikas hadam, so the meat couldn't be eaten. And so we should say in that situation that should be just like pigul. We should say there's no liability. Why is there liability in that case? So why is it mipnei machayavin olav mishum tuma? Why is there liability due to tuma? The answer to that is mipnei shahatzitz miratz. It's because the tzitz is miratza when it comes to tuma. Meaning to say, in general, the tzitz is miratza for tuma. So just because the meat became tameh, even though technically the meat cannot be eaten, but the tzitz is still miratza for that meat. It still affects acceptance, and therefore the zrikas hadam is considered to be a good zrikas hadam, and therefore there will be a liability in terms of kares, in terms of tumas haguf, nitma in. And so the Gemara now says that the Brisa is saying that when the meat became tameh before the zrikas hadam, so then we say that tzitz is miratza. But yotze lo, but apparently that's not true. If it was yotze, let's say it left the proper area, we would not say that the tzitz is miratza in the same way. Now man shamat le da'amar ein zrika moelas liyotze. Now who's the Tana that holds that zrika is not moelas, that Zrika is not effective by Yotze, because again, in a situation of Yotze, even before the Zrikas Adam, we're saying that in such a situation, that is not like a case of Tumah. If there was Tumah before the Zrikas Adam, then we would say there is liability, because the tzitz is Meratza. But if there's Yotze before the Zrikas Adam, apparently that would be something where there's no Shas HaKosher, and there we would say, in such a case, that there would not be a liability. And so who's the one that says Zrika is not Moelis Liyotze? That happens to be Rabbi Eliezer. So clearly this brisa is Rabbi Eliezer. V'katani, and yet this brisa is also clearly saying the Meratza tzitz al achilos, that the tzitz is Meratza al achilos, and so therefore we cannot reverse the opinions. Rabbi Eliezer is the one that says that tzitz is Meratza al achilos, and it is not Rabbi Yossi, so Rabbi Yossi cannot be the author of that second brisa. And so the Gemara instead answers, Elamar Rav Chisda, rather Rav Chisda says, Lokash, it's not difficult. The contradiction between the two brises can be resolved as follows: Ha Rabbi Eliezer, Ha Rabbanan. The second brisa is Rabbi Eliezer, and again the first brisa is the Rabbanan. But the Gemara still says, Eimor de Shamad Leila Rabbi Eliezer de Meratza tzitz al achilos. Okay, so it's true. We see that Rabbi Eliezer says that tzitz is Meratza by achilos, but the Lokanis mishamad le, do we see that Rabbi Eliezer does not impose a fine? Because again, the second brisa is also saying that no fine is imposed in a situation of mezid. And the Gemara continues and answers in yes. Ki hechi de Shamad Leila Rabbi Yossi, just like we see that Rabbi Yossi does not impose a fine. Shamad Leila Rabbi Eliezer. We see the same thing according to Rabbi Eliezer. Detanya, as we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Eliezer, Omer Rabbi Eliezer says, Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, truma so truma. Whether b'shogeg, whether b'mezid, the truma is going to be a good truma. But the Gemara still asks, Eimor de Shamat Leila Rabbi Eliezer b'truma dekila. It's true that Rabbi Eliezer says that there's no fine by truma, but that's more lenient. But b'kadshim dechamiri mishamat le. But by a case of kadshim, where it's more strict, do we really hear that he goes that far, that there's no fine in that situation? But the Gemara says to that, if so, if you're going to make that argument, ha aman tirmiyah, then you have nobody that you can say that this second brisa follows. So we have to say that Rabbi Eliezer applies it to kadshim as well. And Rashi explains, the brisa said, V'im tomar basar shenitma lefnei zrika, if you're going to ask, what about meat that became tummy before zrika? V'achalo betumas haguf la'achar zrika, and it's eaten betumas haguf when the person is tummy after zrika, mivnei machayav, and all of why is there a liability to kares in that case? Halo haisalo shasa kosher, again, in that case, there is no time when it was fit. V'anon pigel hu dematina, now we just excluded pigel. In a case of pigel, we said it was never fit, and therefore there's no liability. De'ein chayav, and there's no liability. Avol nitma, but by the case of tummy, afilu kodem zrika, even if the meat became tummy before zrika, v'yachar zrika achalo, when he ate it after zrika chayiv, there is a liability. And the answer was shahat tzitz meratza, the tzitz is meratza on tumma, lemahave zrika mal yasa. Again, that doesn't mean that the meat can be eaten betuma when the meat is tummy. It just means that tzitz is meratza, that the zrika is considered a good zrika. V'nitar letahorim karina be, we refer to it that it's mutter to tahorim. That's how we refer to this meat, even though technically v'yafal pishalon nechol, even though technically it cannot be eaten. And again, we make that distinction, nitma lefnei zrika, hu dechayev olav ha'ochlo la'achar zrika b'tumas haguf. Only if it becomes tamei before the zrika is the person chayev if he eats it after the zrika b'tumas haguf. But yotzei lo, but let's say it leaves the proper area before the zrika, there we're not going to say that there's a liability, mishum de lo have a zrika mal yasa, because in that case, the zrika is not considered even a good zrika once it was yotzei. The ein hatzitz meratz al hayotzei, that tzitz is not meratz on yotzei. De lo haisa lo shasa kosher, so that becomes a case with no shasa kosher. And man shamatle do amar ein zrika moelis biyotze. Who's the one that says that zrika is not effective by yotze? Lemahave carbon kosher, that it should be considered a carbon kosher. Who's the one that says that? Rabbi Eliezer he beparakama de Meila. That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. We find that in the first parak of Meila. To katani besar kodshe kodshim sheyotze lifnei zrikas damim. It says over there, if you have the meat of kodshe kodshim, that they leave the proper area before zrika. Rabbi Eliezer omer moalin bo. Rabbi Eliezer says there is Meila. V'afilu la'achar zrika, even after zrika there's meila, mishum de'ein zrika moelis lo lahotzio midei meila, because there the zrika is not effective to take it away from meila. And so then the Gemara said, Elamar Rav Chisda lo kasha, rather Rav Chisda says it's not difficult. Hanach masnisa de le'el, hada katani b'masnisa b'mezid hortza nami b'yachid. That brisa earlier that said that even b'mezid it's accepted by a private individual's carbon, Rabbi Eliezer, that's Rabbi Eliezer, miniktani tzitz meratz al achilos. Because again, Rabbi Eliezer says tzitz meratz al achilos, and that brisa is saying that. V'hadatani lo hortza rabbanon. The one that said it's not accepted is the rabbanon. The lo kanis. The Gemara then said there's no fine. Hecha de zarek dam tamei b'mezid mishamatle. The fact that if a situation happens b'mezid where he throws the blood when it's tamei, do we see that there's no fine? And then the Gemara said, well, if we don't say that, imkena mai tirim, if so, who can be the author of that second brisa? L'hadakatani hortza, to that brisa which said hortza, and therefore we have to say that Rabbi Eliezer does go that far. Rabbi Eliezer says that there's no fine imposed by truma, and there is no fine imposed when it comes to kachim. And the Gemara continues with another answer to the contradiction between the two brisas. Ravina says, Tomaso bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid hortza. When we're talking about the tumah happening, whether b'shogeg or b'mezid, there we say it's accepted, there we say that tzitz is meratza. In other words, the second brisa, when it says shogeg and mezid, it's talking about the tumah happening, b'shogeg and b'mezid. But zrikasa, when it comes to the throwing of the blood, that's what the first brisa is talking about. So b'shogeg hortza, if the blood is thrown by mistake, then we say it's accepted. B'mezid lo hortza. But if the blood is thrown on purpose again in a situation of tumah, when the blood becomes tamei and then it's thrown on purpose, then lo hortza, then it is not accepted. And so we're making a distinction in terms of what happened b'shogeg, what happened b'mezid. According to Ravina, the second bryce is talking about the tumah happening, whether b'shogeg or whether b'mezid, whereas the first bryce is talking about the zrikas adam. If the zrikas adam happens b'mezid, then that will not be accepted. Rashi explains, Tomaso bein b'shogeg, meaning bein shenitma b'shogeg, bein shenitma b'mezid, whether the tumah happened by mistake or on purpose, hortza, it is accepted im zarku b'shogeg, if it was thrown, if the blood was thrown by mistake. That's what the second bryce is talking about. V'hadatani lo hortza, and when it says that it's not accepted, amezid dezrika kai, that's talking about if on purpose he threw the blood, he realized it was tamei blood and he threw it, there already we say that it is not going to be accepted. And the idea is that over there, if it is thrown, if the blood is thrown on purpose, even though it was known that it was tamei, so there we impose a fine. And the Gemara continues with another answer to the contradiction between the two brisas. Rav Sheila says, Zrikaso, when it comes to the throwing of the blood, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, hortza, doesn't matter if it's thrown b'shogeg or b'mezid, it is accepted. That's the second brisa. And Tomasa, when it comes to the blood becoming tamei, so there we make a distinction in the first brisa, b'shogeg hortza, if that happens by mistake, then it's accepted. B'mezid lo hortza, but if the tumah happens on purpose, so then it is not accepted. The Gemara asks on Rav Sheila, Ula Rav Sheila, but according to Rav Sheila, Hadakatani, but in the second brisa it says Shenitma bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid. It says it became tamei whether b'shogeg or b'mezid. Clearly talking about the tumah happening b'shogeg or b'mezid, not talking about the zrika happening b'shogeg or b'mezid. And the Gemara answers and says Hachi Kamar. According to this approach, according to Rav Sheila's approach, you read the brisa as follows: Nitma b'shogeg, if it becomes tamei b'shogeg v'zarku bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, and then the blood is thrown whether b'shogeg or whether b'mezid. So then hortza, again, then it's going to be accepted. And again, the first brisa tells us that if the tumah happened b'mezid, it is not going to be accepted. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chavav Amud Aleph.